I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. On today's episode, I'm delighted to say that Chris Bevan has agreed to join me on this virtual sofa. Chris will explain his career history in a moment, but I think that the diversity across his career provides him with a real depth of understanding of what it takes to deliver transformational change within an organisation. And I'm sure you'll find this show really interesting. Let's get on with it by introducing Chris now. Hi, Chris. Great that you could join us today. I'm really looking forward to this show after our discussion the other week. Your career has spanned multiple sectors, but two appear to have been more prevalent than others, telecoms and retail. And I'm sure, both of those have undergone significant change over the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm sure there'll be some great stories to tell. But can we start as we normally do and just tell us a little bit about your career to date and how you got into change and transformation in the first place?
Yeah. Well, look, thanks for inviting me. It's a joy to talk to you about this. I've been in the world of work for 45 years now. I still think that I'm the fresh-faced 21-year-old, but every time I see the reflection, I realise that, no, I've got the lines from the 45 years, but that's been split into 25 years of sort of corporate life, where I was, especially in retail, CPG, supply chain, and senior executive posts for UK and American companies. And then 20 years as an independent consultant in various guises, working with organizations, other consultancies, working independently. And what I've done is worked with the areas I've worked are really Europe, UK, and the US. And I've worked almost exclusively as an independent into the last 10 years of my corporate life in the world of transformation and change. And I've worked across multiple industries, and as you said, retail, finance, mobile telecommunications in its very early days, which then became sort of more more telecom, and in supply chain. So I've worked on startups, the startup of Virgin Mobile back in 1999. I don't know if anybody still remembers the finance company Egg, but I worked on the launch of Egg. I also worked with brands.
I was in Egg. I was in the startup phase of Egg as well, which was very spooky.
Well, I was working in the Dudley. Apologies to go back country. And I think the other office was in Derby. Yeah. And it was my first introduction to teleconferencing. Because in Dudley there was this big teleconferencing suite, and that was in my early days of working independently. Right. But I've also worked in retail for Waitrose, Tesco's, Morrison's. Worked for Huawei. If I'm still allowed to mention that name in the UK, Ericsson and Credit Suisse. So I've worked across a lot of big brands and seen a lot of company cultures and a lot of geographical cultures as well.
You described the approach that you're taking with OutV of that of a player coach. Do you want to just explain a little bit more about that and how that approach benefits the organisations that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to give a bit of context, part of our philosophy is that you cannot do transformation to organizations. Absolutely. It has to come from within the organization. But the majority of organizations we engage with don't really have a lot of experience in leading and delivering transformations, which are very complex. A lot of people have experience of delivering small elements of incremental change, but not if we were to truly use the word transformation in its fullest sense. And so there is a transition that they have to go through, and we have to mirror that transition. So we have to be doing a lot right at the beginning. So we're playing the game, if you like, while also sort of helping to develop the leaders, understanding the psychology of change and helping them transition from being operational leaders to transformational leaders. We then revert more to coaching them in doing the job rather than us doing the job. Yeah. So that's what we mean by player coach. We're always coaching. because if the transformational outcomes are going to be sustained, we're not going to be there all the time. So they have to be able to lead in a transformative environment, and that becomes our legacy. So that's what we mean by player coach.
No, great. And that leads me on to another question, I suppose, in terms of how you define transformation. You're just saying there that there's, that lots of people think just general business change is transformation, but how would you define transformation?
Well, if we have on our website and other places, we define sort of the difference between transformation and change, and you can look it up in the dictionary.
Yeah.
But now I've got to remember every word, haven't I? But transformation is, if you take, the example we would give would be a chrysalis transforming into a butterfly. It's not a caterpillar with wings. It is a different animal. It's a different insect, or whatever the appropriate term is. And change, and the dictionary definition is something like changing within the same form. So if you take an operating, an operating model of an organization, a change is changing that operational model, incrementally changing it without fundamentally changing to another model. So for us, transforming an organization is transforming it into something else. Now, a good example, over the last 9 months, we've seen a lot of retailers become online retailers by necessity. That is a different way of doing business. That is transforming from a bricks and mortar to an online retailer. And having done some work at ASOS and other sort of online retailers, it is a different way of working. So you can still have the same business, but the way you deliver it is going to transform. Absolutely. And you can transform parts of an organization, not just, not the whole ecosystem.
No,
does that
totally
answer
agree.
the question?
No, absolutely, yeah. And just going back to the example that you were giving earlier in terms of egg, in my opinion, that was transformational, from going from, as you say, in Dudley, the prudential banking operation, to one that was completely changing the way financial services and ultimately other services would be delivered to individuals through that whole telephony and online presence that Egg was trying to create.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that First Direct were in the market before Egg were
they were
launched. But First Direct, to me, were a traditional bank that would only deal with you on the telephone. Everything else behind the telephone was like a traditional. But I think you always have some organizations that point the way without going the full journey. And First Direct, I would say, were one of those. And Egg sort of came up and really redefined financial services and banking. No,
I agree. So we started to speak after you posted an article a few weeks ago on LinkedIn, and I think it was entitled "Transformation Failure: Why It Happens." And you started to mention sort of 6 core causes of failure. Do you want to talk us through, maybe 2 or 3 of those?
Yeah, absolutely. Every other year, Bain & Company or McKinsey or somebody will produce a report, and there seems to be this magic 2 numbers, 70% and 30%. And what they purport is that 70% of transformational programs fail, and the 30% obviously succeed. Now, a friend and a colleague of mine back in 2007, 2008, we picked up a McKinsey report that said exactly the same thing. And we decided to see how far back we could go to identify when the 70-30 started. We stopped at 1985 when a professor, David Alexander, I think his name was, produced a report and he worked for what was then called the Cardiff Business School, Management School. And he produced a report which said roughly the same thing. But he was talking about technology programs failing, because this was in 1985. I remember it was the period of information engineering, and tech was the thing that everybody was implementing. And so this 70-30 has been out there in the industries for the last 35 years. and yet we still get reports saying 70% fail.
Yeah.
So we have spent the last few years trying to understand why that might be. And the article that very kindly just referred to was in two parts. The first part was saying why organizations continually fail or continue on a method or an approach that produces that 70% failure. I'll give you, there is an overarching reason, we think, and that's what we call operational thinking.
Yeah.
Now, the majority of leaders of organizations, they're very successful in running their operation. They have gone up the ladder of the industries that they're in, maybe in different companies, but they have gone up built their expertise in certain functions, running an operation, maybe the majority of them incrementally changing that operation, but they're running an operation, the rails of which were put down decades ago by somebody else. And the playbook for those rails, or how you put those down, probably written 200 years ago, pre-Victorian times, in terms of functions, structures. Adam Smith wrote his book. There's another guy whose name escapes me who wrote the management science sort of back in the early part of the last century. And nothing's changed, really. And so if you've been brought up thinking in a certain way, using reference points from 10, 20, 30 years ago, just updated with some data, then if you go into a transformation with that operational thinking and that functional way of doing things, expecting to have data every Friday on your dashboard about how, what performance you've done that week or that month, you're set up for failure anyway. So that operational thinking, if you like, as a backcloth or as a context for why things go wrong, then if you understand that, then other things like what we call rush to execution is the next one.
Yeah.
So we've worked for a lot of organizations, and I'm sure that the listeners to this and you yourself, Tony, would have been talking to leaders of an organization that have just published their strategy. They've paid millions of pounds, gold bars, to somebody to help them develop their strategy. And so they've got to justify the money that they spent. They've got to be seen to be doing things. So then all of a sudden a portfolio of change is set up, or their existing portfolio is modified. And then business cases for each program or each project would be created. They would be presented to the board. They'd be given money, and off they go. But again, if you think back to the operational, vertical, functional way that people have been brought up, the projects and programs, again, are vertical programs that are independent usually of each other because there's nothing to stitch them together. But then they throw change management in the last 25% of the project, where of course that's going to stitch it together. But change management, as it's practiced in a lot of places, so this is a rather broad explanation here, which is going to probably annoy some people, but the change management is about training, business readiness. It's at the end of the process. Change ought to be managed from day one of the thinking about the change. And so that rush to execution produces siloed transformation, which then, yes, we do the process, we do the people, we do the technology in the program. And so if you're delivering a new finance system, and I've seen this, where, finance is a hub of an organization, its interfaces in and out just about every part of the organization. If you haven't really addressed that sort of horizontal sort of interface in and out, it doesn't matter. The finance system isn't going to deliver what you wanted it to deliver.
Yeah, totally agree.
And so, that rush to execution is again a fundamental sort of reason, we think, why these transformations fail.
I think before you go on to that, just picking up on that a little bit, I think in my experience, that rush to execution also comes from the way that organisations tend to run the business cases, so and develop the business cases, and sign business cases off. So they'll create the business case that says within an 18-month period we will deliver X, Y, Z. And day one is when not necessarily when we get sign off. They put a fixed date in 18 months hence, and it takes 3 months to get the business case signed off. And suddenly that 18-month program becomes a 15-month program. So all hell breaks loose because we're 3 months behind schedule already. And it's just that sort of, as you say, that sort of very structured, siloed thinking, as opposed to just stepping back and saying, does this actually make sense from an organisation perspective, from a consistency perspective across all the various initiatives that we're undertaking. And the second part I'd raise, it was an example I got involved. I got pulled into an organisation probably about 10 years ago, and it's just talked in the way that you were talking about the finance system. This was a supply chain system improvement, and the organisation was pan-European. And this system was going in to go live in virtually every country on day one, which was a recipe for disaster generally. But they'd done exactly as you were describing. They'd run it as a technology program, a technology project, and then in the last sort of maybe 20% of the time, brought the change people in to help embed it. And didn't actually put sufficient change people in to even have any chance of doing it, because they were trying to go live in something like 15 countries on one day. And we got brought in because it was obviously everything was red in terms of the reports, and it's like, can you come in and resolve it? And it's like, well, no, you've got to come back and step back and completely change the way you're thinking about implementing this. And it was this sort of, well, it's a technology, it's in supply chain buying, and forget about every other aspect, of which there were at least 15 different organizations, country organizations, that they had to interface with. So
there's that sort of I joke about, in Ireland, isn't it? And the punchline is, well, I wouldn't start from here.
Yeah.
And that's when you look at how far an organization has got, and it's, well, you can't restart from here. You've got to go back almost to the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I cut you short on the third one.
Yeah, the third, well, the three of the six that we mentioned, and not to go through them all, is what we would call digital illiteracy. You can expand that to transformational illiteracy. And this is not a negative. This is not saying that people in the boardroom are bad people, but if they haven't been exposed to what the capabilities are, or how transformations really work, you can't expect them to go home on a Friday night and over the weekend, the transformation pixie dust is sort of sprinkled on them. There is a learning to go through, but there is, I think, we all have an ego to different, sense. And when you're sitting in the boardroom, everybody looks up to the board members as knowing everything.
Yeah.
Which is something that we're brought up with. But if one doesn't know the art of the possible, what technology can do to support our business, as opposed to how can we support technology, then how can one expect these people, good people, successful people, to really sort of get committed to actually really transforming their business models, their operating models, their evolving their sort of cultures and their behaviors. And the whole, there's a lot been written over the last 12 months about, we're in sort of industry 4. We're in the technological age truly now. And we agree with that. But in the previous 3 industrial revolutions, people have supported technology, from the steam engine, to drive the mills in the north. It was the technology that devised the process, and then people had to adapt to that technology-driven process. we firmly believe that now in Industry 4, it's got to reverse. So it's got to be human-centric, it's got to be people-centric, and the technology has got to support what we want our people to do. And what we don't want them to do, we do want the technology to do. So if you look at things like robotic process automation, RPA, in my experience, that mimics what an individual will do. Then you've got the next generation, which is intelligent automation, which has the learning sort of within it. If we can get to that point where rather than use those technologies to reduce the numbers of people, but if we can use those technologies to really open up and break out the innovation that people have within them, then I think you need to understand and be literate about that digital capability to enable us to understand what our people are capable of and what they can do. So and you can't delegate it to a CIO or a chief digital officer. This has got to be something, if it's going to be transformational, the board have got to be committed to, and the CEO has to be committed, not just involved. And this might sound a little bit revolutionary, but what we find, especially in retail, there's the ops board meeting every Monday where the very senior people are looking at the performance of last week. And lots of boards tend to spend a lot of time on, the here and now, where we are and the near-term horizon. But if an organization is embarking on a transformation, and there's always very high risk in a transformation, we would suggest that's the board's responsibility. So if the board focus on the transformation, and if the operational managers and directors and what have you, who can run the operation, then we think that that's a good sort of division of labor at the top of an organization, where the board are committed to delivering the transformation in the right way. Of course, they're still responsible for the business, but they have people who do that for them. But I just think that as one goes up that ladder vertically, it's very difficult to let go of what you did, because that's what got you to where you are. So the human trait, I suppose.
And I think there's that sort of old mindset, isn't there, of feeling threatened by people that are coming up the organisation because they'll take my role, and actually, that, you need to turn that on its head to say, well, actually, we should be encouraging that. We should be encouraging as much innovation within the teams and allowing the team to develop and to come up with radical new ideas, because actually that will help me to be the best leader, or to lead the best organisation out there in our individual sector. So it's a mindset change for lots of people, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, again, we have part of our philosophy is you have to think differently before you can behave differently, before you can do differently. Yeah. And so that thinking differently, what you've just described there to me is, and you use the word leader, and I think that I agree 100% with that. But a lot of our senior people that have the label leader are actually still senior managers. Yeah. So they manage people managing activity. And it's more sort of directive rather than collegiate and collaborative. Yeah. But I absolutely agree with you.
Who do you think is getting it right, or getting it? Who do you think are the organisations that are better at doing that type of thing? Do you know of many?
Well, I would say that there are lots of startups at the moment. Yeah. There are lots of native, e-commerce companies that are getting it right. Yeah. Mainly because they're not encumbered by that sort of 200-year-old sort of playbook. Yeah. And there's also, I think, another characteristic of a lot of these startups is that when you look at the age of the people who are at the helm and who have got the ideas, they're probably half my age.
So does that lead us to think that for the more established organisations, then they've all the probably the most effective or maybe the most successful way driving that type of transformation is to create a spin out and almost leave the legacy and create something new in the way that Egg did in going back to the example earlier.
Well, I think that there's got to be a reason why. Why are we doing what we're doing? And it's got to be more than just because I think everybody else is doing it, or it's a fashionable thing to do. And so, if to get to what you're saying, I would say that you have to be clear about the why. You have to develop the strategy that supports that why. And there is also something that we call the organizational truth. And if we get that right, and what I mean by the organizational truth, it's really what is the story in this organization today? And there is always, without fail, I've really dug a hole for myself here now by saying that, there is a gap between what the people at the top of the organization see as the truth and what the people sort of at the coalface see as the truth, and something in between. And unless there is that consistent understanding and agreement of what the truth is, then it doesn't matter about the strategy, it doesn't matter about the why. People have got different perspectives. If you've got that right, then I think one of the things we would promote, where it's appropriate, is what we call the new co sort of approach, which is almost what you're saying. Sort of build the new co in parallel with your old co, if you're still with me, and that's your business as usual. And at certain points, the new co can feed into the old co to stimulate that change. So I wouldn't say it's black and white, that you build a new co and then you close down the old co. You could be building the new co as your incubator. You're developing innovations and MVPs and all that sort of stuff, but then you scale up into the old organization because you've got the infrastructure and the people there. So as a concept, we would agree with what you proposed, but how it would play out would depend on the circumstances and the context of the organization and what it was they were trying to do. But I did quite a lot of work in local government. I was involved in an educational charity, and I'd sit at committee meetings and thinking, this is just not fit for purpose. Not the meeting, but the local government environment. But we're never going to change it, because what it would mean is exactly what you said. We need to build a new one in parallel, and then switch over from the old to the new. No politician is going to sanction that and sort of pay for that. But that, I think, is if you're trying to build a new business and a new way of doing it, it has to be the way to go forward.
Yeah, I think just going back to that local government, my experience of government and local government in particular is that they maybe attempted that type of approach, but in terms of the execution, got it wrong when they went through the massive outsourcing cycle, probably 10, 15 years ago, and some very large what are very large organizations now were created off the back of that. But all they did was just outsource the challenges and the issues and passed it on to a third party to sort out. And those third parties are still running the operations in a very similar way, but with a more of a commercial view. And so they didn't actually get the transformation that they were hoping to get. And interestingly, now a lot of them are now bringing those same functions and same organisations back in house.
I think there might be one exception to that sort of national government rule, and it pains me to say it in some respects, but HMRC embarked on a digital transformation. Was it 4 years ago? I don't know it intimately, but I would contend that the Chancellor wouldn't have been able to do what he did at such speed last year. Investment in the digital technologies for HMRC hadn't been made and implemented a few years ago. I totally agree with that. yeah, and you know, they take our hard-earned money, don't they, Tony? So it does grieve me to say it, but you know, then you look at, you know, Department of Work and Pensions and others, and they're still in the mire.
Yeah.
But so there is one exception, perhaps, to that sort of public sector rule.
So throughout your career, as we've said, you've been involved in lots of different organisations, different programs. Which have you found the most interesting?
The most interesting have been where there is a commitment from the top, not just an involvement, because, you know, one can really dive deep into that organisation. If we use the word interesting in the positive sense as opposed to in the negative sense, and substitute the word challenge, Waitrose, for example, was a fantastic environment to go into. But my initial thoughts there were, when I was talking to the various people about going to work there, you know, this was a co-owned business. You know, everybody's going to be really up for it. But what it meant was it was a co-owned business that everybody had a say, or felt they had a say.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there was a big piece of work to get proper engagement as opposed to just communicating to people. And I learned such a lot about, you know, the psychology of change and how people think. And, you know, a lot of people used to say to us, a subscriber to the view that, you know, as human beings, we don't necessarily welcome change. Well, I learned through that process, if people understand why they need to change, or why the world needs to change, or their organization needs to change, if they understand it, they may not agree with everything you've said, but they will fall into line, and there will always be the people that won't, but they're the very small sort of minority. Yeah. And one of the greatest things I learned at the work at Waitrose was that you know, engagement is not communication. And to get good engagement, you need a dialogue model, because you need to be able to speak to people where they are, and there are different mechanisms for doing that. Yeah. And you have to find the right one to talk to a certain person or a certain group of people, and actually listen to them as well. Yeah. So if it's true dialogue, it will go two-way.
I was just about to say that. So I was just about to say that it's that all too often you have a communications plan within a transformation process, and it's not a communications plan, because all it is, it's disseminating information. The true communication is where it's two-way, and you can actually start to uncover so many of the issues and challenges really early on, and do something about them to allow people to move along the journey with you.
Yeah, and at advi, having learned that sort of at Waitrose, at advi now we use different partners. What we understand, we do not have all of the capabilities under our brand roof to deliver, you know, a complex transformation. So we work with partners, some of which provide technology to enable that dialogue to be ongoing 24/7, a bit like a Facebook for the business, you know, so people can talk across peers, up, down, and what have you. And so you can get a pulse of what the thinking is in the business on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. So Waitrose was a truly, I was there originally there for 6 months, and 2.5 years later I left. But I had a fantastic sponsor in the supply chain, the business sponsor, the supply chain director, a guy called David Jones, and we used to have a coffee every Thursday afternoon in his office, and then, you know, it was what's the name of that? You know, the rules where what you say in the room stays in the room. Chatham House, thank you. Yeah. My grey matter didn't work there, but he was so supportive, and his view was, look, I've never done this before. You have. So I know the business, you do this transformation and change. So if we work together, we're going to get there, aren't we? Yeah. And that was so refreshing, you know, to have that. And I knew that he had my back. And he knew that I had his back. I did some work for Digicel in the US. And Digicel were looking to launch a mobile service to compete with Virgin Mobile in the US. And I was asked to go and they thought that they were 6 months away from launching. And I was asked to go with if you like, a business architect's eye and be able to identify, where they had holes in their operation. Now, having come from a retail background, having worked on the launch of Virgin Mobile in the UK, I had a certain lens I was looking at that business. The majority of people who were working for them were either technology based or had come from a mobile telecoms business. And they wanted to sell most of the devices, the telephones and what have you, through retail. Now, I started there in the August, and one of the basic principles, if you want to start selling at Christmas, you sell to the retailers in February, March at the latest, when they're doing all their, if you like, their autumn and winter sort of merchandising plans. So they didn't have a hope in hell of getting into Target and Kmart and all these sort of organizations. But being able to work with people who had such an open mind, even though every meeting we were having, every workshop we were having, we were identifying challenges, it was still a very, very positive environment. Digicel never launched, by the way, in the US, after spending a lot of millions of dollars to get to that point. The owner then decided, no, we're stepping back. Right. Now, I'm not saying that's because of what I did. A lot of people did a lot of work to get there. But even in that face of, I seem to be the one with the words of doom every meeting, it was still a very lively environment, and it was a very positive environment to work in.
And I suppose that leads on to the sort of cultural differences within different countries and different organisations. And do you see that within different countries? So you obviously in that example there, you were in the US. In your experience, are they much more open-minded than a traditional British sort of mindset, or is it down to the individual, or the culture of the organisation that they're working in?
Yeah, but I think the cultural organisation is fed by the, if you like, the national sort of culture, to a great extent, and then you have the person who's at the top leading. Then the influence that they have, contributes to that. But I agree with what you said. I think that there is this more open-mindedness in the US. I haven't worked there for a few years, but yes, to me, it always has been more open-minded. They are less risk averse, but that doesn't mean that it's a pushover. You have to build your case, and it's not always on the numbers. Yeah. A lot of the time, the acceptance is on the potential outcome and the value that outcome can deliver. Sometimes there is a downside in a lack, perhaps, of, you still need discipline, and that's discipline with a small d. Yeah. You need a structure. You need, I would say, more assurance than governance. So you need to have assurance that what you're doing is what you said you would do, and you're using the financial resources properly. You still need to assure that, but it is a fresher sort of environment. Also worked in places like Germany, which are, I talked about this Victorian structure here. The hierarchical structure in Germany, I think is just, it's in everybody's DNA. Yeah. And so decision making has to go through the right sort of channels to get for the right person to make the decision. Yeah. And that just delays things. And then in France, I found that you have to corral more people. So I'm being very general here, so I do apologize to people who may listen to this in different places, but you've got to adapt to those national and corporate cultures. One thing, I mentioned I worked at Huawei. I made, that was in the UK, and I made learned a fantastic lesson there, which was when the people I was working with said yes, they didn't mean yes, I agree. They meant yes, I hear you. Yes. And it took about 2 months for that to sink in with me. But again, that's part of the national sort of culture.
It's about adapting your style and your approach to the culture of the organisation and the people within the organisation, and that's what makes the difference, and that's the value that you can bring to an organisation.
Yeah. Now we have an approach. We wouldn't call it a method. We wouldn't call it a structure. But there are certain things at a high level we would say you have to do. So if you take a normal sort of cycle, there has to be a strategy of what an organisation is doing. Now that could be on 4 pages. It could be on 40 pages. But there has to be a direction that the company is wishing to go, and that delivers the why. Out of that, there comes the change story. You've got to have a change story, which isn't the strategy. It's an explanation of why you have to move to this strategy. We would then say that you have to imagine what the organization, the ecosystem will look like when that strategy is delivered. And then from that, you've then created it's not, you have to bound in some way, what it is you're then going to go and do, which doesn't mean you restrict, but it means you have a playing field in which to play the game. We then have to go to a design at a high level. The outcome of the design phase would be the business outcomes, the capabilities you want, and the roadmap to deliver it. And then you can create the portfolio to deliver it.
Yeah.
Now, we would say you have to go through those phases. But how you apply going through those phases is different almost in every organization. But also in taking that approach, you break it down into the first bit. You then have a better understanding of what you need to do for the second bit, or the second phase. So you can then fund it, resource it appropriately. And as you're doing the design, we would always look to be delivering prototypes or MVPs of the change. And then we're testing them. And then when you get to the portfolio of execution there, you're scaling up those pilots.
Yeah.
You're not then starting to build from scratch. So it's not that old 1990s consulting where you team of people go into the corner for 9 months and develop the design and come out and tell everybody what it is. Yeah. It's a collaborative design that is delivering pilots and solutions through the design phase.
Great. So we usually end these podcasts with what's your number one takeaway, and the one thing that you feel a successful program has to have in place. But it sounds like what you've just described, multiple parts to it, but it's that approach. It's that let's go systematically through those 3, 4, 5 steps so that you avoid that move to execution, that speed to execution issue that we spoke about at the start.
Yeah, yes. And I would characterize that is that if you design your solution, you have a much better chance of delivering the solution rather than trying to design it as you're trying to deliver it. And so, if you're building a house, you don't draw it on a flip chart and give that to the builder. You have an architect that will come in and design it.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that when we're trying to build a new business?
Absolutely. Well, that's great. 45 minutes of sped past. So thank you very much for your time. And we occasionally get questions coming back. Are you happy to answer any questions?
Absolutely. I say we've all got an ego.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's been great, and I'm sure lots of people will take a lot of little golden nuggets from this one.
Well, that would be brilliant. Look, thanks for the invitation. I've enjoyed talking to you about it.
Brilliant. Cheers. Once again, thanks, Chris. This podcast series wouldn't be available if it weren't for the generous nature of the people like Chris who willingly give up their time to share their experience with you. It would be great to show them your appreciation by subscribing to the podcast and sharing your thoughts both direct and via social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, as well as LinkedIn, so please choose the one that best works for you. See you in a couple of weeks with the next Inside Track podcast. Bye for now.